Okay, so these are our notes on nutrient cycles. So our essential question for these notes are, what are the nutrients that cycle in our environment? And we'll talk about the effects of that as well. So first, let's define what the heck is a nutrient. So a nutrient is a substance that an organism has to obtain to grow and sustain life. So if we don't have them, we don't get them. And they are necessary for growth. Therefore, they are the parts of those building blocks. Remember, they're the elements for those building blocks that we talked about. Lipids, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and proteins that we talked about last semester. And remember, we talked about those elements that make it up. So let's see if you remember from last semester. Okay. So what are the four main elements of life? We have carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, carbon, potassium, nitrogen, and oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, sulfur, and oxygen, or carbon, water, nitrogen, and oxygen. So think for a second and think if you can remember. If you said carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, you got it. Some of you may have been pushed here towards water because water is essential, but we're asking about elements, and actually water is a compound, and you'll learn more about that when you get to chemistry. All right, so we did just do our energy flow ideas and what we were talking about, and we did the whole biome project when we talked about how energy is cycled, such as in this food web you see here, and solar energy and heat energy. Now we're going to talk about what happens with the nutrients. You know, we're not just sending energy, we're actually also transferring water, we're transferring carbon and nitrogen that we just talked about, all of these things, right? So the nutrients are purple, and they neither enter nor leave the cycle. Nutrients are matter. And if you remember those laws, that there is the conservation of matter. You cannot create or destroy matter. It has to go somewhere, as well as energy. Energy and matter does not go away. We only have so much of all of it here on Earth, and it actually cycles back and forth, okay? And then energy is in yellow, okay? It's not really, we say it's not really recycled. It's lost in heat, but it goes up into the atmosphere. It does come back down, okay? And it's captured by producers, and it's transferred through consumers, which are in red, is how we transfer the energy. And that's just telling you what these different arrows mean. And each transfer loses energy. Remember, each transfer, you're only transferring 10% of the energy. 90% of it is lost back into the environment, okay? So the first one we're talking about is carbon. We're actually just talking about carbon and nitrogen. Those are our biggest ones here. And so carbon in the environment, it can be carbon dioxide. It can be in sugars. We talked about sugars like C6H12. And how are these forms cycled? Well, through photosynthesis. Remember we learned about photosynthesis, and cellular respiration, right? So plants take in carbon dioxide. They let out oxygen, which we breathe in, and then we breathe out carbon dioxide. Okay. And those are the forms of carbon on our planet, okay? And so here is the carbon cycle, what we talk about. So the carbon cycle is here. Okay, and so what happens is down here, soil bacteria and feeders, okay, give off carbon dioxide out to the atmosphere. And it's taken from the atmosphere by our producers, right? Okay, and then that carbon, as it turns, photosynthesis turns that carbon into sugars and food for the tree that our little bunny here can eat. And so it now absorbs that carbon. So does this little coyote here, as if it eats the bunny, it now has absorbed the carbon, okay? And then when they die, they actually release all that carbon dioxide, not only when they die, but when they respirate, they release that carbon dioxide back out into the air, okay? Which then the trees take back, and we put back in. And so there's things that can disrupt this carbon cycle, add too much carbon that trees can't filter out. And some of the things are burning of fossil fuels actually releases CO2 into the air, and also fire can also release CO2 into the air. And so these things can upset this delicate balance of how much CO2 we release and how much those trees can actually absorb and recycle into something we can use. Okay. It goes to producers, to the consumers. Then they die, goes to dead bodies, goes to the soil, which then releases it back up into the air. So that is the cycle of carbon. Okay. Okay. All right. So what else can we do with cycling? What does cycling mean? So it's the same pool of nutrients supports all life, past, present, future. So that means the carbon we're using now was back around when the dinosaurs were alive, okay? And cycles moves those nutrients from non-living to living, okay? So the air is non-living, moves it into the trees in carbon, and then brings it to the other ones. And it's from environmental to organisms. So we bring it down from the air to support photosynthesis, and then eventually to the consumers. And there's atmosphere cycles of not only carbon, but also nitrogen, okay? And the majority of the nutrients found in the atmosphere is carbon and nitrogen. And the atmosphere get incorporated into living organisms. So carbon and nitrogen can be breathed in and taken in. And nitrogen is usually taken up through the soil. So carbon is photosynthesis. Nitrogen is what we call nitrogen fixation, which means it's absorbed from the soil, from the roots of the plants, and brought into their leaves, which are primary consumers do eat, okay? And then once those animals die, then what happens is they are returned back to the environment for those plants to take up again, okay? And nitrogen is mostly made by decomposers and bacteria. So carbon is from respiration. We get that, which we just learned, right? That we breathe out CO2, put it back in the air, and our producers, our plants, suck it up and make oxygen. Well, nitrogen is actually made in the soil. I just said that it's absorbed through the plants by the soil, and that's because of our bacteria that live down in the soil that like to eat all the dead things, and they actually produce that nitrogen for our plants, okay? So a couple nitrogen facts. So let's learn a little bit about nitrogen. Most of you understand about carbon, but let's learn about nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the most abundant elements on Earth. It is 79% of the Earth's atmosphere is in nitrogen in gas form. Now, plants cannot take the nitrogen from the air into themselves. They actually do have to take the nitrogen from the soil, okay? And then no living cell can exist without nitrogen. You have nitrogen, I have nitrogen, everything has nitrogen. It's part of those nucleic acids, which is part of DNA, which without DNA, we learn we cannot be here, okay? But organisms cannot use nitrogen gas form, just like I said. It has to be in that ammonia form, okay? Okay, and so most plants, animals, and fungi depend almost entirely on bacteria, which bacteria, like I just said, takes down the decomposition, breaks down that nitrogen, puts in the soil that everybody can use, okay? All right, so let's look at the nitrogen cycle. So the nitrogen cycle has two major beginnings and two major paths. And the nitrogen from the soil, air to nitrogen, so it goes from the air to the bacteria, okay? And then the bacteria to the plants, okay? Or to decomposers. Or it can come from dead organisms that the bacteria break down and pass that in to the plants, okay? So here's our little nitrogen cycle, okay? So there's nitrogen in the atmosphere. It can be taken, okay, by some bacteria. It can be breathed in by these bacteria, taken in through the soil, okay? And it makes what we call ammonia. Okay, and once it makes ammonia, it can go to these denitrifying bacteria, which will breathe it back out, send it into the atmosphere, or it can be taken up by the plants, okay, to the producers, passed on to consumers as they eat it. Then those consumers die, boom, and then the nitrogen goes back into the soil and back to the bacteria and back through the cycle again. Okay, so it starts in the air. Okay, and the nitrate goes down into the soil and it goes back up into the air. Okay, it can also go into the bacteria, made into ammonia from the bacteria, uptake by plants, to the producers, to the consumers, they die, and it goes back into the bacteria. So this is a whole cycle. Nitrogen never leaves. Remember, you cannot create or destroy it. So it has to cycle through the entire system. All right, so now we learned kind of the cycles. One of the things you've probably heard is the greenhouse effect. So what the heck is the greenhouse effect? So the greenhouse effect is gases which interfere with cooling of the earth. So you've probably heard of global warming. It's because of what we believe this greenhouse effect. And we call it the greenhouse effect because if you walk into a greenhouse, you will feel the heat, right? A greenhouse really does keep heat and humidity in for those plants to grow. And one of the biggest one that we're having problem with is that CO2. Remember in our cycle, we saw how more CO2 than what the plants can absorb is being introduced through fossil fuels and possibly fires, okay? So the less trees we have, the less CO2 that can be pulled out of our atmosphere. So as we go through deforestation, we're actually causing a disruption in that CO2 cycle, okay? We can also release CO2 from air conditioners and refrigerations, so we want to be careful. And then methane can also be stuck up there and cause an increase in CO2. It also is one of our greenhouse gases. And this is not the word no, it is nitrogen oxide. And so that's another gas that we watch in the greenhouse effect. And so this global warming is something we think is an effect of these increase of greenhouse gases. So what could be the consequences? And we're going to watch a movie of some of the consequences that we think may be happening because of this, okay? And so this is kind of just a map of what the theory of the greenhouse gases and the global warming is. And so what happens, or what we have definitely seen happen, is an increase in CO2. And from that increase of CO2 in the atmosphere, from factories, natural things like volcanoes, but factories are something that are not natural. Houses will produce it, vehicles, okay, forest fires and volcanoes are all normal, and CO2 increases, and it's what happens, okay? But what happens is it comes in and it actually goes up into our atmosphere, and it does not allow the heat here on the earth to actually exit. So instead of the heat actually going all the way through all of it that needs to go out, what's happening is because of these increased gases, we see it bouncing off and heading back into the earth. And so this is why we call it global warming, that we're not actually releasing all the heat as we were, say, 100 years ago. Okay. So the ozone, what is it? You've probably heard it 100 times, but they are oxygen layers that protect the earth from damage. So basically they block some of those UV rays, they block some of the heat, so we don't actually fry from the sun, okay? If you go to some of the other planets in our solar system, humans could not live there because the ozone is too thin, okay? And so if we receive the full strength of the sun energy, it would be extremely disruptive. And it's about 19 miles up. The highest point on Earth is Mount Everest. That is the thinnest air you could get to. And that's only approximately 5 miles up in off the ground. And ozone layers can also cause damage when they take up all the oxygen molecules. So we don't want them to also take up all the oxygen molecules, but we get that from smog, and ground level is really where it sits. So this is a graph of what we see happening as the CO2 increases in our atmosphere, okay? So this blue line, this little dotted line, is as our CO2 in our atmosphere is going up, and up. And what we see here is the temperature. So you can see we go through high, whoo, we go high, low. But overall, if I was to draw a line, you can see that since 1860 to 1995, this is when it's done, the average temperature here on Earth has increased. And not only has the temperature increased, but so has the CO2 up in the atmosphere. So this is the correlation that scientists are actually watching and seeing what is going to happen, okay? As we watch these levels increase and we see that temperature increase, how is this going to affect the delicate ecosystems that are here on our Earth, okay? All right. So we'll talk more about greenhouse gases and all those effects when we watch our movie, but go ahead and process your notes. You're going to highlight any important notes. You're going to make connections to any of your notes in the left-hand column. Write any questions you may have in the left-hand column, and then use your highlights, connections, and questions for your summary. And if you have any write a 3 to 5 sentence summary. Can't forget that one. Okay, if you have any questions, please let me know.